Talking wildfire now, and it's a little odd because it's the winter time here in Utah, not something that a lot of us are thinking of, but you really should be thinking of it 365. It's important, especially if you're a homeowner or live near that wildland urban interface. Brad Washa with USU Extension is an assistant professor, storied career as a wildland firefighter, but also working in this realm, but now works in the wildland fire science program there. It's great that you're sharing your insight with the next generations here for folks that are interested, but something you wrote recently is kind of looking at the compare and contrast, if you will, of Utah and what we've seen in California. So the big question, is Utah at risk for similar wildfires, or how those structures stacked up as to what we just saw in LA?
I don't think we'd see the level of devastation California saw. I mean, we don't have the population like California has. So I don't think we would see that, but there's still a lot of parallels as far as we still have wildland urban interface. You know, we typically don't see Santa Ana type winds like they have there in the middle of winter, which still is somewhat of an anomaly for them even, for a fire to be occurring in January.
Well, we'll get into those winds here in just a moment because we have our own, downslope wind events and those east winds that, depending on where, maybe even along the Wasatch Front, has an impact. But we'll get to that in just a sec. I know that the Parley's Canyon fire is something a lot of folks remember from 2021 because of the obvious interstate sort of interruption there right along I-80, threatening Summit Park and that area. What is your connection to that fire? You live in the area, right?
Yeah, I live in Pine Brook, so just outside of Park City, and my neighborhood was evacuated. So I was evacuated, and then I was home between fire assignments. I had a fire assignment in Oregon, then was reassigned to California, but I happened to be home and had worked with the local Northern Utah Incident Management Team. And with that, they asked, hey, can you cover as Division Soup for a day or two? So Division Soup is typically the highest qualified person on the line. So I had the division that was basically protecting my neighborhood.
But I want to ask you about your home specifically. When you just said, hey, I'm evacuating, or my home isn't. Did you do any last final checks? And what have you done around your property over the years to make sure it's as hardened as possible?
You know, a number of years ago, I was on what was called the Waldo Canyon fire that burnt into Colorado Springs, and 340 some homes were lost in that. After that fire, I came home and looked at my house really hard. It's like, I mean, those homes, you wouldn't think of all of them would have burnt in Colorado. And so I did look at my house and looked at different things around the house. And even when I moved in, I put river rock around the base of the house instead of wood chips. And I didn't plant any trees or vegetation immediately adjacent to the house. So I had done some things like that beforehand to kind of fire harden it. I had a couple vents and I put some screening across that so embers wouldn't get in that and get into the house itself.
All good things that people probably can do around their properties.
Yeah, definitely.
Takes a little mindset, little pre-planning, little investment perhaps, but better than the alternative.
Definitely. And then like when the Parley's Canyon fire came and was truly evacuated, it's like, what more can I do, in the short span of time? And had a wooden fence that I was a little concerned about because that touched the house. And when I was in Colorado Springs, saw where a fence started on fire, it burnt up into the person's porch, and the next day the house was gone. So I actually removed part of the fence that connected to the house. I left the gate open on the other side, so there was no fence connecting it. I took my garden hose and put it out in the front lawn in case, it was a crew that didn't have an engine. They would have a potential source of water. Probably should have put a ladder out there too. But
sounds like you've worked in fire before.
Yeah.
With all those things.
Yeah, 35 years. So.
Exactly. Here in Utah, we just have kind of a different layout compared to other states, but we have had catastrophic fires. I think a lot of people go back to Dollar Ridge or Bryan Head perhaps, where there was actual structural loss. When you look back at some of those major incidents, what could people have done perhaps in some of those areas? We're talking maybe a little bit more remote than maybe the Wasatch Front here, but what can people do if they've got that ranch property or if they've got that larger space to look after? I
mean, there's similar things. I mean, when we look at the home ignition zone, you don't want anything around 5 feet from your house. So whether or not you're in the Wasatch Front or if you're in Park City or if you're out in Vernal or that area, you still want to not have any vegetation or things that will burn within 5 feet, firewood next to your house. Then that 5 foot to 30 foot, you want, maybe a tree or two, and maybe look at trying to plant deciduous trees versus a conifer. And then from that 30 feet to 100 feet or even farther out, if you're on a steep slope, you want to have your vegetation thinned out and cleared out from there.
Fire's on the mind for so many, not just us here in Utah, because we do have a traditional, fire season where it's a little bit more active, although we did have a couple grass fires just last week. interestingly enough, when you look at Los Angeles in California, which has a very rich fire history, and sometimes for all the wrong reasons like we're seeing right now with Palisades and Eaton and some of those larger scale fires that have ripped through communities. What are some of the parallels? I know you touched on it a little bit, but that you draw between what we're seeing in Los Angeles and just general here in Utah.
Some of the parallels that we see are, that wildland urban interface. So that's where people build their homes in the wildland. So where forest and trees meet the homes. So, they have that in California, and we have the very same thing here in Utah as far as people moving farther up on the bench and into the front range, just like is happening in California. So we have that, and other places within Utah, you see, within a community, people are moving farther out from the community center. So you have those similarities. The whole insurance thing, it kind of started with California with people's insurance being canceled. We're seeing that happening in Utah, and I know the state legislature, in fact, today I think it's before committee, is looking at some options to perhaps help Utah as far as.
We've done a number of stories on that as well. If you'd like to check them out, you can head to our website, KUTV.com. I think it's interesting because there's always the differences between Utah and California or the LA County area. You alluded to it. Just the sheer amount of people. I mean, LA is about as chokehold as you can imagine, but we are growing here. But what are the big differences that you see between the wildland urban interface, for example, in Utah versus what butts up in LA County and some of those far-reaching places?
Well, LA County, that's in what's considered Mediterranean climate. So they get wet winters, and then the rain shuts off, and then they get dry conditions, which in this case have continued into winter. And so we don't, and then the vegetation that grows there is chaparral, very volatile fuel. So
hard to get rid of too.
Yes, yeah. So we don't have those conditions or those sort of vegetation types, but we do have some vegetation like Gamble's Oak, for example. That grows down into the communities, and people have homes in Gamble's Oak, and that can be very volatile. It's got a waxy substance on it, and if you get a late season frost, you'll get a dead component in there, and there's actually been firefighters killed in Colorado in that sort of situation.
Earlier in the conversation, you spoke about the Santa Ana winds. Now here, not a meteorologist, but we have some in earshot here, so they could always yell over and correct me. But downslope wind events, those easterly sort of east winds that can fan some of those flames. We've seen it in history do that along the Weber River, for example, and you alluded to it in some of your research and report. Canyon winds too. I think of maybe Immigration Canyon, where there's homes embedded in these thicker bits of understory too. There's got to be communities out there that if this happens, they are definitely at risk to some extent of what we just saw.
There is. One thing though, our big east winds here usually follow like a cold frontage passage with precipitation. So the ones that do cause damage to, power outages and that sort of thing, usually they follow a wet situation. So you don't really have the wildfire risk. But we do have the diurnal winds, so the evening winds that, each one of these canyons, be it the Weber River or Immigration or Parley's, each one of those has a really good flow going through it. Spanish Fork, those windmills are there for a reason, because there's that evening wind. It's not a daytime thing, but an evening wind. And those winds coming through there, for example, in South Ogden a number of years ago, there was a fire, the Uinta fire, that started and burnt 3 structures, I believe, but then continued down along the Weber River and the I-84 corridor. And if it'd been a little bit over to the right or left, it would have taken out a bunch more homes, and more homes have been built in that area since then. So
any thoughts to summarize here? We have the similarities, but we also have some significant differences that maybe would suggest it would take something, really next level to have that amount of devastation here in Utah, right?
Yeah, we're not going to see 10,000 homes lost. Although, last summer we had that fire just above the Capitol, and, luckily they were able to get resources on it, and it wasn't at risk, but a lot of people were evacuated. I don't think any structures were lost, but, we do have the setup where, if you lose your home, you lose your home, whether or not you're in California or in Utah, and part of living in this sort of environment, you have a shared responsibility if you live in the wildland urban interface to handle your home, because everybody thinks, well, there's a fire station down the road from me, or there's a fire hydrant in front of me. There's not enough structure engines or engines in general to be at every house to protect you. So you need to do that. And then, you know, you go farther back and we need to create resilient landscapes, because it's not just the fire itself, but the post-fire effects, as far as, you know, you get a major rain event and then you get flooding going on. So
definitely something they're thinking about in Marysville, for example, right now after the Silver King fire this past summer, and always something that should be on the mind. Brad, thank you for coming in. Thank you for the insight.
Thanks for having us.